Kodak invented the digital camera in 1975. Then they killed it. 27 years later, they filed for bankruptcy while the rest of the world went digital. They had the future in their hands and threw it away. Imagine inventing the exact technology that will define the future and then deliberately destroying it because you're too afraid to change. That's exactly what Kodak did. They didn't fail because they missed the digital revolution. They failed because they saw it coming, created it themselves, and then chose to ignore it. At their peak, Kodak was one of the most valuable companies in the world. They employed over 145 people. They controlled 90% of film sales and 85% of camera sales in America. The phrase Kodak moment became part of everyday language. They were photography, but by 2012, they were bankrupt. Their stock went from $90 to 37 cents. Thousands lost their jobs, and the most painful part, it was completely preventable. In this video, you're going to discover the real reason Kodak collapsed, how they invented digital photography but refused to sell it, why having a monopoly actually destroyed them, what happens when a company values short-term profits over long-term survival, and the lessons every business needs to learn from the most tragic failure in technology history. This isn't just a story about one company. It's a warning about what happens when you're so successful that you become blind to change. Because Kodak didn't die from bad luck. They committed suicide. Let us go back to 1975. A young engineer named Steven Sasson was working at Kodak's research lab in Rochester, New York. His boss gave him an interesting assignment. Kodak had just acquired some new technology, a charge-coupled device or CCD that could convert light into electrical signals. His boss wanted to know if they could use this to create an image. Sasson spent about a year working on the project, and in December 1975, he successfully built the world's first digital camera. The camera was huge. It weighed 8 pounds and was the size of a toaster. It captured black and white images at a resolution of 0.01 megapixels. That's 10,000 pixels total. For comparison, your smartphone camera today has over 12 million pixels. The images were stored on a cassette tape, and it took 23 seconds to record a single image. To view the image, you had to connect the camera to a television. It was clunky, slow, and impractical, but it worked. It was a digital camera, no film needed. Sasson was excited. He demonstrated his invention to Kodak executives. He showed them how it worked. He explained the potential, and their response was lukewarm at best. According to Sasson, they asked him why anyone would ever want to look at their pictures on a television. They couldn't see any practical application, but more importantly, they saw it as a threat because Kodak's entire business model was built on film, and this device didn't need film. Here's what you need to understand about Kodak's business in the 1970s. They weren't really a camera company. They were a film and printing company that happened to sell cameras. The real money wasn't in selling cameras. It was in selling film, developing chemicals, and photo paper. Every time someone took a picture, they needed to buy film. Every time they finished a roll, they needed to pay to develop it. Every time they wanted prints, they paid again. It was a recurring revenue model that printed money. Kodak's profit margins on film were incredible. It cost them pennies to manufacture a roll of film that they sold for several dollars. The margins on photo paper and chemicals were even better. This business was so profitable that Kodak was one of the most valuable companies in the world. They paid excellent salaries. They had generous pensions. They were the anchor employer in Rochester, New York. The entire city's economy depended on Kodak. Everyone either worked for Kodak or worked for companies that supplied Kodak. So when Steven Sasson showed up with a camera that eliminated film, he wasn't presenting an opportunity. He was presenting an existential threat. If digital photography took off, Kodak's business would disappear. All those profitable film sales would vanish. The developing business would collapse. Kodak would have to completely reinvent itself. And the executives looking at this clunky prototype in 1975 decided, That was a problem for another day. The technology was too primitive. It would take years, maybe decades, for digital to match the quality of film. They had time, so they did what most companies do when faced with disruptive innovation. They buried it. Kodak didn't completely ignore digital photography. They continued research. They filed patents. In fact, Kodak held patents on many fundamental digital imaging technologies, but they didn't commercialize them aggressively. They didn't market digital cameras. They didn't pivot their business model. Instead, they focused on protecting their film business for as long as possible. This strategy is called the innovator's dilemma, a term coined by Harvard professor Clayton Christensen. It describes what happens when successful companies fail. Because they focus too much on their current customers and current profits, they can't or won't invest in disruptive technologies that threaten their existing business, even when those technologies are clearly the future. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, Kodak watched as digital imaging technology improved. They saw competitors like Sony and Canon experiment with digital cameras. They saw computers become common in households. They saw image quality improve, and they kept hoping that film would remain dominant. They launched marketing campaigns emphasizing the superior quality of film. They promoted the emotional value of physical photographs. They tried to convince people that digital was inferior. And for a while, they were right. Early digital cameras were expensive and produced terrible images. Film was still better for most consumers. Professional photographers wouldn't touch digital. Kodak's film business remained strong throughout the 1990s. Revenue kept growing. Profits stayed high. The stock price climbed. Everything looked fine. But underneath, the foundation was cracking. The problem was that digital technology improves exponentially. Film technology had basically maxed out. It couldn't get much better than it already was. But digital cameras improved dramatically every year. Resolution increased, file sizes got manageable, prices dropped, and most importantly, a new advantage emerged that film could never match: convenience. With digital cameras, you could take unlimited photos at no additional cost. You could see the image immediately. You could delete bad shots. You could share photos electronically. You didn't need to develop anything. In 1991, Kodak actually launched one of the first commercial digital cameras, the DCS-100. But it was designed for professional photojournalists, not regular consumers. It cost $13,000. That's over $28,000 in today's money. They weren't trying to replace film with digital. They were creating a niche product for a specialized market. Meanwhile, other companies were working on consumer digital cameras. In 1994, Apple released the QuickTake, one of the first consumer digital cameras. It was made by Kodak but sold under Apple's brand. It cost about $750 and captured images at 0.3 megapixels, still terrible by today's standards. But it was affordable and accessible. People started buying them, not in huge numbers, but enough to show there was demand. Sony released the Cyber Shot in 1996. Canon released the Power Shot. These companies saw digital photography as an opportunity. They didn't have film businesses to protect, so they could embrace digital fully. They competed on price and features. They innovated rapidly, and slowly but surely, they started winning market share. Kodak executives saw all of this happening. They weren't blind, but they were trapped by their own success every year. Their film business still made billions of dollars. Their shareholders expected profits and dividends. Their employees expected salaries and pensions. If they aggressively pushed digital cameras, they cannibalized their film sales. Revenue would drop before digital could replace it. The stock price would crash. Shareholders would revolt. It was a no-win situation. So Kodak tried to have it both ways. They invested in digital camera development, but continued to emphasize film. They created hybrid products like the Advantix Preview camera in 1996, which used film but had a digital display so you could preview your shot. they launched an online photo sharing service called Kodak Gallery. They tried to bridge the old and new worlds, but this strategy of straddling both technologies meant they never fully committed to either. They were half pregnant with digital, and that doesn't work. By the late 1990s, consumer digital cameras were becoming mainstream. Image quality had improved to the point where casual photographers couldn't tell the difference between digital and film prints. Prices dropped below $500, then $300, then $200. Digital cameras became Christmas gifts. People started leaving their film cameras in drawers and buying digital. And here's the crucial part. When people switched to digital, they stopped buying film. They stopped paying for development. They stopped ordering prints. All of Kodak's most profitable businesses started declining, and they declined fast. Film sales in the United States peaked in 2000 and then dropped off a cliff. Within 10 years, the market had shrunk by over 80%. The digital revolution that had been slowly building for 25 years suddenly hit with devastating force. Kodak finally got serious about digital cameras in the early 2000s. They started producing consumer-friendly digital cameras at competitive prices. By 2005, Kodak was actually the #1 seller of digital cameras in the United States. They had successfully made the transition. They were selling millions of digital cameras, but there was a massive problem. Digital cameras weren't profitable the way film had been. Camera manufacturing is a low-margin business. You're competing on price and features with Sony, Canon, Nikon, and others. Everyone has access to similar components. The technology isn't proprietary. You're basically assembling parts into a box. The profit margins are thin. Kodak was selling more cameras than ever, but making far less money per unit. And worse, selling digital cameras didn't create recurring revenue. Once someone bought a camera, Kodak didn't make any more money from them. There was no film to buy, no developing to pay for. The customer was gone. Kodak tried to replace the recurring revenue with printing. They pushed photo printers for home use. They created kiosks at stores where people could print digital photos. They partnered with retailers like CVS and Walgreens to offer printing services. The idea was that people would take digital photos and then pay Kodak to print them, just like the old days except without film. But it didn't work the way they hoped. People printed far fewer photos than they used to. In the film era, you developed a whole roll and printed everything. Maybe 36 photos per roll. With digital, people were selective. They only printed their favorite shots, and many people stopped printing altogether. Why pay to print photos when you can view them on your computer or share them online for free? Social media was emerging. Facebook launched in 2004. Photo sharing went digital. The whole concept of physical photo albums started to feel outdated. Kodak's revenues began falling. In 1999, they had revenue of over $14 billion. By 2006, it was down to $10 billion. By 2011, it was $6 billion. They were shrinking fast. They cut costs aggressively. They laid off thousands of employees. They closed factories. They sold off divisions and patents. But nothing could stop the bleeding. The film business was dying, and digital wasn't replacing those profits. Meanwhile, something else happened that Kodak never anticipated: the smartphone. In 2007, Apple released the iPhone with a built-in camera. It was only 2 megapixels, pretty bad even for the time. But it was always with you, and it was connected to the internet. You could take a photo and immediately share it with friends. Apps like Instagram, launched in 2010, made photo sharing social and fun. Suddenly, the camera wasn't a separate device you brought with you. It was part of your phone. This destroyed the consumer digital camera market. Why buy a separate camera when your phone has one? Smartphone cameras improved rapidly. By 2012, the iPhone had an 8-megapixel camera that took better photos than most point-and-shoot cameras. The convenience factor was impossible to beat. Camera sales collapsed. Companies like Sony and Canon survived because they focused on high-end professional cameras, where smartphones couldn't compete. But Kodak's digital cameras were mostly consumer models that competed directly with smartphone cameras. They were obsolete almost overnight. Kodak tried to adapt to the smartphone era. They released smartphones with good cameras. The Kodak Easy Share in 2008 was designed around photo taking and sharing. But it was too late. Apple and Samsung dominated the smartphone market. Nobody wanted a Kodak phone. The brand was associated with cameras, not phones. It didn't make sense to consumers. By 2011, Kodak was in desperate trouble. Their stock price had fallen to around $1 per share. They were burning through cash. They had pension obligations to thousands of retired workers, but no way to fund them. They tried to raise money by selling their patent portfolio. They owned over 1,000 patents on digital imaging technology. Remember, they invented digital photography. Those patents were valuable, but finding buyers took time, and time was something Kodak didn't have. On January 19, 2012, Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. It was a stunning fall. A company that had dominated photography for over a century was insolvent. 10,000 employees lost their jobs. Retirees saw their pensions cut. The city of Rochester, which had been built around Kodak, was devastated. It was one of the most dramatic corporate collapses in American history. During the bankruptcy process, Kodak sold most of its patents for about $500 million, far less than they'd hoped. They shed unprofitable divisions, they restructured their debt, and they emerged from bankruptcy in 2013 as a much smaller company focused on commercial printing, not consumer photography. Today, Kodak still exists. They employ a few thousand people. They make specialized printing equipment, packaging, and other products. But they're a shadow of their former self. The Kodak moment is gone. So what went wrong? How does a company that literally invented the technology that defined the future end up bankrupt? There are multiple factors, but they all come down to a few key failures. First, Kodak was trapped by the innovator's dilemma. They had a highly profitable business model based on film. Digital photography threatened that model. Even though they invented digital cameras, they couldn't bring themselves to aggressively market them because it would cannibalize film sales. They prioritized protecting their existing business over embracing the future. This is a classic mistake. The fear of losing what you have prevents you from gaining what you could have. Second, Kodak underestimated how quickly technology would improve and how quickly consumer behavior would change. In 1975, when they invented the digital camera, it seemed like a toy. Film was clearly superior. They assumed it would take decades for digital to catch up, if it ever did. But technology improved faster than they expected, and more importantly, consumers didn't need digital to be as good as film. They just needed it to be good enough. The convenience and cost savings of digital outweighed slightly lower image quality. Kodak kept comparing digital to film on technical specs, while consumers were making decisions based on convenience and value. Third, Kodak's leadership was rooted in the past. The executives who ran Kodak in the 1980s and 90s had spent their entire careers in the film business. They understood film. They were comfortable with film. They knew how to make money with film. Digital was foreign and scary. This is a common problem in large, successful companies. The people who rise to leadership positions are those who succeeded in the old system. They are often the worst people to lead change because they are emotionally and financially invested in maintaining the status quo. Fourth, Kodak's culture was risk-averse. When you're highly successful and profitable, you become conservative. You don't want to rock the boat. Innovation becomes about incremental improvements to existing products rather than radical new directions. Kodak spent decades making film slightly better when they should have been betting on digital. Their R&D budget went to perfecting film technology when it should have gone to digital innovation. Fifth, Kodak misunderstood their own business. They thought they were in the film and chemicals business, but they were actually in the memories business. People didn't buy film because they loved film. They bought it to capture and preserve memories. If Kodak had understood this, they would have realized that digital photography was a better way to serve their customers' actual needs. Instead, they defined themselves by their products rather than by the value they provided. Sixth, Kodak waited too long to change. By the time they got serious about digital in the early 2000s, they were playing catch-up. Sony, Canon, and others had years of head start. They built expertise, supply chains, and brand recognition in digital. Kodak was entering a crowded market with no unique advantage. If they'd embraced digital in the early 1990s when they had the technology lead, they could have dominated. But they waited until they were forced to change, and by then it was too late. And finally, Kodak got hit by a second disruption before they recovered from the first. They were still trying to figure out the digital camera business when smartphones came along and made digital cameras obsolete. It's hard enough to survive one technological disruption. Surviving two in quick succession is nearly impossible, especially when you're already weakened. The tragedy of Kodak is that they had everything they needed to succeed. They had the technology. They invented digital photography. For crying out loud, they had the brand. Kodak was one of the most trusted names in photography. They had the resources. They were a multi-billion-dollar company with deep pockets. They had the talent. Some of the best engineers and researchers in the world worked for Kodak, but they lacked the vision and courage to change. They were so afraid of losing their profitable film business that they let the entire company die. Let's talk about some specific decisions that illustrate Kodak's failure. In 1996, Kodak had a chance to acquire a small startup called Shutterfly. Shutterfly offered online photo printing and sharing. It was exactly the kind of service Kodak should have been building. But Kodak passed on the deal. They didn't see the value. Shutterfly went on to become a successful company worth over $1 billion. Kodak eventually launched a similar service called Kodak Gallery, but they were years late to the market. In 2001, Kodak considered acquiring a company called Ophotno, which offered online photo storage and sharing. This was before Facebook, before Instagram, before smartphones. If Kodak had bought this company and built it into a major platform, they could have owned social photo sharing. But again, they hesitated. They didn't want to invest heavily in something that didn't involve selling film or cameras. Eventually, Kodak did acquire Ophoto for a reported $90 million, rebranded it as Kodak Gallery, but they never gave it the resources or strategic focus it needed to compete with Facebook and, later, Instagram. Another missed opportunity was professional digital imaging. Kodak developed excellent technology for medical imaging, industrial inspection, and scientific research. These were high-margin, specialized markets where Kodak's expertise in image sensors and processing could have dominated. But they treated these as side businesses, not core focus areas. They never invested enough to capture these markets fully. Competitors like Siemens and GE built strong positions in medical imaging, while Kodak dithered. Kodak also made strategic mistakes in their digital camera business. They focused too much on consumer point-and-shoot cameras, the lowest margin segment. They should have focused on enthusiast and professional cameras where margins were better and competition was less intense. Canon and Nikon dominated the DSLR market for serious photographers. Kodak had a few professional digital camera models but never committed fully. If they'd built a strong position in professional digital cameras, they could have maintained higher margins and brand prestige. There's also the patent situation, which is particularly frustrating. Kodak owned patents on fundamental digital imaging technologies. These patents were incredibly valuable. Apple, Samsung, Google, and others were all using technologies that Kodak had invented. Kodak could have made billions through licensing. They did pursue some patent litigation and licensing deals, but not aggressively enough or early enough. By the time they tried to monetize their patents seriously, they were desperate for cash and couldn't negotiate from a position of strength. They eventually sold their patent portfolio for a fraction of its potential value. One thing that is often overlooked is that Kodak actually saw some success with digital. In the early 2000s, from 2003 to 2007, they were the top-selling digital camera brand in the United States. They beat Sony, Canon, and others in market share. But this success was misleading. They were winning on volume, not profitability. They were competing on price, which meant thin margins. And their success in digital cameras actually accelerated the death of their film business. Every digital camera they sold was one less reason for people to buy film. They were cannibalizing themselves, and the new business wasn't profitable enough to replace the old one. This is a key lesson for any company facing disruption. Just because you're selling a lot of the new product doesn't mean you're succeeding. You need to look at profitability and long-term sustainability. Kodak sold millions of digital cameras, but lost billions of dollars in the process. They were going through the motions of adapting, without actually building a viable business model. Let's compare Kodak to a company that successfully navigated a similar transition. Fujifilm. Fuji was Kodak's main competitor in the film business. They faced the exact same disruption when digital photography emerged. Film sales collapsed for Fuji just like they did for Kodak, but Fuji survived and even thrived. Today, Fujifilm is a $20 billion company with diverse businesses in medical imaging, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, and yes, premium cameras. How did Fuji succeed where Kodak failed? First, Fuji diversified aggressively. They didn't just focus on cameras, they took their expertise in chemicals and materials and applied it to other industries. They moved into medical imaging, using their knowledge of film chemistry to develop products for diagnostic imaging. They got into cosmetics, using antioxidant technologies they developed for film. They acquired pharmaceutical companies and got into drug development. By 2012, when Kodak was bankrupt, less than 1% of Fuji's revenue came from photographic film. They completely transformed their business. Second, Fuji's leadership acted decisively. In 2000, the CEO of Fujifilm, Shigetaka Komori, saw the writing on the wall. He knew film was doomed. He launched a massive restructuring plan. He closed facilities, laid off workers, and invested heavily in new businesses. It was painful, but he did it while Fuji still had cash and time. He didn't wait until they were desperate. He acted proactively. Third, Fuji maintained their premium positioning in cameras. They focused on high-end models with unique features. Their X-series cameras became beloved by enthusiast photographers for their retro design and excellent image quality. They charged premium prices and maintained healthy margins. They didn't try to compete with everyone on price like Kodak did. Kodak could have done all of this. They had similar resources and capabilities, but they didn't. Why? Leadership and culture. Kodak's leaders were too conservative and too slow to act. They hoped the problem would go away or that they could manage the transition gradually. Fuji's leaders understood that gradual change wasn't an option. They needed radical transformation, and they had the courage to do it. There are broader lessons here that apply to any business, not just photography. First, past success doesn't guarantee future success. In fact, past success can be dangerous because it creates complacency and resistance to change. Kodak was so successful for so long that they couldn't imagine failure. They thought their dominance was permanent. It wasn't. Second, you can't protect an obsolete business model forever. Kodak tried to extend the life of film through marketing and incremental improvements. But when a superior technology emerges, the old technology dies. You can delay it, but you can't stop it. The choice is whether to lead the transition or be destroyed by it. Third, having the technology isn't enough. Kodak invented digital photography, but still failed. Technology is only valuable if you commercialize it effectively. If you have a great technology but refuse to market it because it threatens your existing business, you've accomplished nothing. Someone else will commercialize it and beat you. Fourth, listening to your current customers can be misleading. In the 1990s, Kodak's current customers were film users who liked film. When Kodak asked them what they wanted, they said better film. They didn't say digital cameras because they didn't know they wanted digital yet. If Kodak had only listened to current customers, they would never have embraced digital. You have to anticipate what customers will want in the future, not just what they want today. Fifth, culture matters enormously. A culture that resists change and punishes failure will struggle with innovation. Kodak's culture was hierarchical and conservative. People who suggested radical changes were seen as troublemakers. The reward system favored protecting the status quo. In contrast, companies like Apple and Amazon have cultures that embrace change and tolerate failure. They experiment constantly, knowing most experiments will fail but a few will succeed dramatically. Sixth, you have to be willing to cannibalize yourself. This is incredibly hard. It means deliberately harming your profitable business to build a new one. But if you don't cannibalize yourself, someone else will. Kodak should have aggressively promoted digital cameras even though it would have killed film faster. By doing so, they could have owned digital and maintained their market position. Instead, they tried to protect film, which meant competitors took the digital market. And finally, timing matters. There's a window of opportunity to adapt to disruption. If you act early, you can lead the change. If you wait too long, you're playing catch up and will probably lose. Kodak had a 25-year window from when they invented the digital camera in 1975 to when digital went mainstream in 2000. That is a huge amount of time, but they squandered it. By the time they tried to change seriously, it was too late. The human cost of Kodak's failure is worth remembering. At their peak, Kodak employed 145,000 people. Most of them were in Rochester, New York. These were good jobs with good pay and excellent benefits. Families built their lives around Kodak careers. Parents expected their children would work at Kodak too. The company provided stability and prosperity for an entire community. When Kodak collapsed, tens of thousands lost their jobs. Many were in their 50s or 60s, too old to easily find new careers. They'd spent their entire working lives at Kodak and suddenly had nothing. Pensions were cut. Healthcare benefits disappeared. People who thought they were secure found themselves struggling. The psychological impact was devastating. It wasn't just about money. It was about identity and purpose. These people had been part of something great, and then it was gone. The city of Rochester suffered enormously. Unemployment spiked. Property values fell. Businesses that supplied Kodak or served Kodak employees closed. The tax base shrank, which meant the city had less money for schools and services. Rochester went from being a prosperous manufacturing hub to a struggling Rust Belt city. It's recovered somewhat, but it's never been the same. This human cost is important to remember because it is easy to talk about Kodak as failure, as an abstract business case. But real people paid the price for the leadership's mistakes. Thousands of families had their lives turned upside down because executives made bad decisions. That makes the failure not just tragic but also infuriating. Kodak's story is the most tragic failure in technology history because it was completely avoidable. They invented the digital camera in 1975. They had a 25-year head start on everyone else. They had the brand, the resources, the talent, and the technology to dominate digital photography. But they threw it all away because they were too afraid to change. They prioritized short-term film profits over long-term survival. They underestimated how quickly technology would improve and consumer behavior would shift. They waited too long to embrace digital. And when they finally did, they entered a crowded market with no advantages. Then smartphones disrupted them again before they could recover. By 2012, a company that had once employed 145,000 people and controlled 90% of the film market was bankrupt. The Kodak moment became a cautionary tale instead of a celebration. And the most painful part is that everyone at Kodak saw it coming. Steven Sasson showed them the digital camera in 1975. Engineers and researchers warned that digital would eventually win, but leadership chose denial over action. They hoped they could manage the transition gradually, protect film sales a little longer, squeeze out a few more profitable years. They were wrong. The lesson from Kodak applies to every business and every industry. The world changes, technology advances, customer preferences shift, and companies that refuse to adapt don't just decline, they die. Success creates complacency. Profits create resistance to change. And by the time you're forced to change, it's too late. Kodak had everything they needed to survive and thrive in the digital age. They just lacked the vision and courage to use it. That's what makes their failure not just tragic, but also inexcusable. They didn't lose because they were unlucky or because competitors were smarter. They lost because they chose to lose. They chose comfort over courage, present over future, and certainty over risk. And in doing so, they destroyed one of the greatest companies in American history. Which company today is making the same mistakes Kodak made?